I stood in my kitchen, pouring myself a cup of coffee, when I heard it, the unmistakable blare of a DJ horn echoing from my backyard pond. Then came the whoops, the splash of bodies hitting water, and what sounded like someone shouting that the beer cooler had capsized. I sprinted outside in slippers and pajamas, only to stop dead in my tracks as I stared at a neon-lit pontoon boat bouncing in the middle of my pond. Loud music pulsed through portable speakers strapped to tiki torches lining the shore. Floating near the boat was a giant inflatable swan, half-sunk, with a screaming HOA president clinging to its neck like a scene out of a poorly directed pirate movie. There was even a banner stretched between two stakes that read "Welcome to Karen's Lagoon." My pond. My private, clearly fenced-off, fully documented pond. I hadn't authorized any of this, and as I stared at the floating circus bobbing in my water, one thought flashed through my mind like lightning across a stormy sky. They wanted a party. Fine. But next time, they'd be swimming with snapping turtles. It all started 2 weeks before that fateful splash. I had just returned from a week-long business trip. I'm Ethan, a software engineer by day and amateur wildlife photographer by hobby. I bought this property 5 years ago for one reason: the pond. Nestled behind my modest house was a natural spring-fed pond, crystal clear and surrounded by tall reeds and overhanging willow trees. It was my escape, my sanctuary. I'd spent years landscaping it, building a small dock for kayaking, even installing solar lights that gave it a magical glow at night. Not once had it ever been touched by anyone else. Until Karen moved in. Karen was the newly elected president of our HOA, and she'd already built a reputation like a tropical storm, loud, erratic, and always arriving uninvited. Within her first week, she had fined the Johnsons for having unapproved wind chimes, demanded that one neighbor paint their mailbox to match her palette, and even told me to move my trash bins 3 inches closer to the curb. She was that kind of woman, the kind who wore power suits to mow the lawn and held HOA meetings like corporate board presentations. I had no real beef with her at first. I figured if I kept my head down, she'd stay out of my life. I underestimated her. The first sign of trouble came when I noticed a strange set of tire marks on my side path leading to the pond. It wasn't part of any community walking trail, so I installed a small no trespassing sign and shrugged it off. A couple days later, I spotted a group of unfamiliar people lounging near my dock, drinking canned cocktails and snapping selfies with my lilies. I stepped outside, waving politely but firmly, asking them what they were doing. One of them, a man in aviators and a Hawaiian shirt, smiled and said Karen invited them to the pond party. Pond party, I asked. He laughed like I was the punchline and pointed to the banner taped to a lawn chair: Karen's Boat Bash, Saturday 3 p.m. I marched straight to Karen's door, knocking hard enough to rattle the frame. She answered with the smile of someone who genuinely believed the world revolved around her. When I explained that the pond was private and not HOA property, her smile didn't waver. "Oh, Ethan," she cooed, "you really need to read your HOA handbook. Clause 14 Section B, communal recreation access during summer month." She waved a binder in front of me like a judge holding a sentence. I stared at it, baffled. I'd read the handbook cover to cover when I moved in and never saw anything like that. I asked to see the exact page. She flipped through quickly but conveniently skipped showing it. "You're welcome to join us tomorrow," she chirped as she closed the door in my face. I spent the night digging through every piece of documentation I had. I pulled out the property deed, land survey, the HOA charter, even my closing paperwork. All of it confirmed the same truth: the pond was mine. Not the HOA's. Not the community's. Mine. It wasn't even within their jurisdiction line. But I knew just walking over with paper wouldn't work with someone like Karen. No, I needed witnesses. So I waited until the next HOA meeting. I arrived 10 minutes early, armed with maps, documents, and a folder thick enough to choke a horse. Karen was already there, sipping iced coffee and holding court like she was queen of the cul-de-sac. When the topic of community recreation came up, I stood up and calmly laid out my case. I explained the property lines, the pond's exclusion from the HOA boundaries, and read from the city-approved zoning map. I even passed around copies. Karen didn't even flinch. She leaned back, crossed her arms, and said, "Ethan has been a wonderful neighbor, but I'm afraid he's mistaken. We received a revision notice in 2019 giving us summer use rights to all natural water features within the neighborhood limit." Several heads nodded. I asked for proof. She said the document was pending digitization. I said I'd contacted the city and confirmed no such revision existed. She smiled again and said the city must have misfiled it. It became clear this wasn't about logic. It was about power. Karen had built herself a little kingdom and invited her court to party in it. My property rights meant nothing in the face of her delusion. And as more neighbors began to side with her, I realized they didn't care about who was right. They cared about having a fun place to hang out. That made me dangerous. That made me the villain. The meeting ended with no resolution. Karen made an offhand comment about organizing a water yoga class next weekend, and everyone laughed. I sat there stunned. I'd just been told my property didn't belong to me anymore, and everyone applauded. That night, I sat by the pond under the moonlight. I watched a frog leap from lily to lily, oblivious to the drama unfolding around him. I knew that confronting Karen again would lead nowhere. But there were other ways to restore order. Not violent, not illegal, just a shift in nature. After all, if they insisted on turning my pond into their playground, then it was time they met the real residents. Residents with hard shells and harder bite. And so the plan was born. I would take back my pond. Not with lawyers. Not with shouting. But with strategy. With surprise. And with a little help from nature itself. The next time they came to party, they'd get more than just a splash. They'd get the bite. And Karen wouldn't know what hit her. Not until it snapped. The morning after the HOA meeting, I woke up with one mission echoing through my mind like a battle cry. If Karen wanted a party pond, I'd give her one, with permanent residence she'd never forget. The idea came to me the night before, while watching one of my favorite documentaries on native wildlife. Snapping turtles. Resilient, territorial, and legally protected in my state if introduced with a permit and handled by a licensed professional. It wasn't just poetic justice, it was ecological precision. Karen wanted to act like she ran the land, but she hadn't met Mother Nature's most bite-happy bouncers yet. My pond was about to become the toughest VIP lounge in the neighborhood. I made a few calls, did some quiet research, and within hours found myself driving out to a local wildlife rehabilitation center nestled in the edge of the county. The place was humble, but packed with tanks and enclosures full of critters with names like Buster, Slappy, and Gamera. I met with Dr. Vicky, a herpetologist who had the energy of a caffeine-fueled science teacher and the wit of a stand-up comic. When I told her about Karen and the invasion of my pond, she didn't blink. "You want snapping turtles to act as biological security guards," she said, scribbling on a clipboard. "That is the most productive form of petty I've ever heard." I explained I wasn't looking to hurt anyone, just to re-establish natural boundaries. She nodded and led me into a shaded greenhouse, where several snapping turtles swam lazily in a large tank. These guys were rescues, she explained. A couple were abandoned pets, some displaced from drained wetlands. Perfectly healthy, legal to relocate, and best of all, they don't like being disturbed. You introduce a few of them into a private pond and you're not breaking any laws, especially if the owner, you, signs off. I nodded and asked about risk. Vicky assured me they wouldn't actively attack people, just scare off anyone who got too handsy or nosy. They're not predators, she said. They're just very firm about their personal space. I left with a plan, a folder full of paperwork, and a list of names for the turtles that made me grin: Chompers, Sergeant Snaps, Mudface, and Big Sheila. Over the next few days, we coordinated the transport and introduction. I told the neighbors I was working on an eco-balance restoration project. Karen didn't bother asking what that meant. Too busy planning her next social event, I guessed. We introduced the turtles gently, giving them room and plenty of food. Within hours, they took to the pond like they'd lived there forever. I installed motion-triggered cameras along the edge, not for spying, but for watching how the new tenants adjusted. At night, I'd watch chompers patrol the deeper end like a cranky submarine. Big Sheila had claimed the lily pad zone, while Mudface buried himself in the muck near the dock. My private army was settling in beautifully. Of course, none of this would mean anything without Karen giving me an excuse to let nature take its course. She didn't make me wait long. The very next weekend, I woke to the sound of laughter, splashing, and what might have been an off-key rendition of Sweet Caroline. I peered out my upstairs window and saw it, another boat party. This one was even bigger. A pontoon raft lit with solar lanterns sat squarely in the middle of the pond. People were wading in the shallow parts, while others floated in novelty tubes shaped like donuts, ducks, and an actual inflatable flamingo with a speaker duct-taped to its neck. Karen stood at the helm of the pontoon like a cruise director, wearing a sun hat the size of a satellite dish. I stood still, waiting, watching, and then it happened. One of the guests tried to climb back into the raft and let out a shriek. "Something just bumped me," he shouted. Karen rolled her eyes. "Probably a stick." But then another person screamed and scrambled out of the water. "Something's in there. It's huge." I recognized that look. Chompers had made his debut. I watched on the camera as the turtle emerged, not attacking, just drifting slowly near the raft like a prehistoric lifeguard on duty. His presence alone caused panic. People started splashing and kicking wildly, flipping over their own tubes. One woman hurled her cocktail into the reeds as she fled. A man dove off the raft and swam to shore like a Navy SEAL under fire. Then came the inflatable flamingo. One of the turtles, I think it was Sergeant Snaps, latched onto its neck and punctured it in one swift bite. The speaker let out a garbled musical death cry as the float sank dramatically, gurgling into the pond. Karen lost her balance and tumbled off the raft, shrieking as she went under and surfaced with algae in her hair. The entire scene was chaos. People grabbing pool noodles like lifelines, Karen screaming for someone to help her out while slipping on mud, a man dropping his phone and swearing loud enough to scare nearby birds into flight. I simply sipped my coffee and let the moment settle like a warm sunrise over justice. Eventually, the pond cleared. People dragged themselves out looking like they'd just survived a shipwreck. Karen stomped across my lawn soaked from head to toe. "You did this," she screamed, pointing a shaking finger at me. I calmly stepped outside and asked her what she was talking about. "You put monsters in there." I raised an eyebrow. "You mean the native wildlife? I have all the permits." I even offered to show her the paperwork. She sputtered, red-faced and still dripping. "This isn't over," she hissed before storming back toward her house, slipping once more on a wet patch of grass. Later that evening, I reviewed the footage from the cameras and compiled it into a neat folder on my desktop titled Pond Panic Reel. Just in case she tried anything formal. I figured she'd lick her wounds and back off. I was wrong. The next morning, I found an official notice taped to my door. An HOA complaint citing me for environmental endangerment, accusing me of introducing dangerous animals into a community recreation site. The audacity. I called Dr. Vicky, and she burst out laughing when I read the complaint. "This woman thinks snapping turtles are a hazard," she chuckled. "I'll get the Wildlife Board to send over our permit approval stamped and signed." "You're fine." But this wasn't just about turtles anymore. Karen had made it clear she wasn't going to stop until she won. She had no idea the storm she'd invited by trying to bully her way through private property law. And I had no idea she had even more tricks up her sleeve. But I wasn't worried. I had facts, footage, and a pond full of peaceful enforcers who didn't care who was president of the HOA. They just wanted to be left alone. Just like me. The war wasn't over. But I had drawn the first bloodless blow. And Karen now knew one thing for certain. The pond bites back. 3 days after the party panic, My doorbell rang at precisely 9 a.m. I opened it to find two people in forest green jackets standing on my porch, clipboards in hand and serious expressions on their faces. One was a tall man with thick glasses, the other a short woman with a badge pinned to her chest that read Environmental Inspection Unit. She introduced herself as Officer Darlow with the local conservation board. "We received an anonymous tip," she said, glancing past me toward the backyard. "There are reports that you've introduced potentially dangerous wildlife to a community access water feature. May we inspect your pond?" I didn't even have to ask who filed the complaint. Karen's vendetta had officially escalated to a government level. But I was ready. I stepped aside and gestured toward the pond like a maitre d' welcoming guests into a five-star restaurant. The inspectors walked slowly around the pond's edge, jotting notes and taking photos. I showed them the documentation from Dr. Vicky, the permits, the conservation tags on the turtles, even footage of the release and behavior logs. They asked thoughtful questions, took samples from the water, and examined the pond's natural habitat. Eventually, the man chuckled as he watched chompers sunbathing lazily on a flat rock near the dock. "These guys aren't aggressive," he said. "They're shy if anything." The woman nodded. "Whoever reported this either doesn't understand pond ecosystems or has a personal grudge." I said nothing, but I must have smiled too wide, because she added, "We're filing this as compliant. You're in the clear. No violations here." As they left, she handed me a copy of their conclusion. I tucked it into my growing Karen folder like another trophy. But Karen wasn't done. Later that evening, the HOA meeting kicked off inside the clubhouse with extra chairs brought in, no doubt thanks to Karen's latest flyer campaign warning neighbors of my, quote, biological assault. As I entered, I could already hear murmurs rippling through the crowd. Karen stood at the front with her trademark clipboard, her hair extra shellacked, her expression dead serious. "This meeting has been called to address a rising concern that affects the safety and enjoyment of our entire community," she began. "There is a predator infestation in our neighborhood pond." She flipped on a slideshow that projected an image of Chomper's midyawn. Neighbors gasped. One woman clutched her pearls. I waited, arms folded, until she opened the floor for discussion. I raised my hand. "Ethan," she said without looking directly at me, "you've already made your stance clear." I cleared my throat and walked to the front anyway. I brought visuals of my own this time, a full property map from the county, dated and notarized with clear boundary lines. I explained that the pond, despite her repeated claims, had never fallen under HOA jurisdiction. I reminded them that her event had caused multiple injuries due to lack of safety oversight. I showed copies of the permits and a letter from the Conservation Board declaring my pond compliant and natural. Karen's face tightened with every sentence. But I wasn't done. I played a short clip from my camera footage. People screaming, a turtle drifting calmly in the background, and Karen yelling "get out of the way" as she flopped onto the mud. It was funny, but I didn't laugh. I let the silence speak. "That's not a predator," I said. "That's a turtle minding its own business. Just like I was." The room sat still for a second before someone near the back snorted. Then another chuckled. Soon half the room was laughing, and Karen's face turned crimson. She tried to pivot. "We can't let this set a precedent. What if someone else decides to fill their backyard with snakes or coyotes or alligators just because they're native?" She tried to motion for a vote on a new bylaw banning, quote, dangerous aquatic species from all communal areas. But the treasurer, a mild-mannered man named Phil, finally spoke up. "I think it's time we stop pretending the pond is communal," he said. "We've seen the records. It's not. And this whole crusade is starting to feel personal." Karen stammered something about group safety, but the mood had shifted. A vote was taken. The bylaw was rejected. For the first time since she was elected, Karen didn't get her way. After the meeting, a few neighbors even came up to me, offering quiet support. One woman said her kids had nightmares after the pond party and thanked me for keeping things calm. Another neighbor asked if he could photograph the turtles sometime for a school project. I said yes, of course. But I knew the storm wasn't over. Karen might have lost that round, but she wasn't the kind to back down just because the facts weren't in her favor. I knew her type. She saw losing as temporary. And her ego was now wounded. A week later, I noticed something strange. An unfamiliar car parked outside my driveway for hours at a time. A man taking pictures. Once, I saw Karen speaking with him across the street. She noticed me looking and quickly walked away. That night, I checked the county's public website and found a newly filed civil complaint. Karen had hired a lawyer and was suing me personally for emotional distress, loss of communal use, and something so ridiculous I had to read it twice: loss of perceived recreational territory. It was the most absurd legal document I'd ever seen. But it was real. She was trying to take me to court. I called my lawyer, an old college friend named Tamir, who laughed so hard he nearly dropped his phone. "This is nonsense," he said, flipping through the file. "But we're going to treat it seriously. We'll hit her with the boundary records, the conservation documents, and the HOA charter. She's going to regret trying this in front of a judge." But Tamir also warned me. "Be prepared. People like her don't play to win in court. They play to wear you down outside of it." The next day, as if on cue, a drone buzzed above my backyard while I was drinking coffee. It hovered directly over the pond, zooming in on the turtles. I looked around. No one in sight. But then a little voice inside me clicked. Karen was trying to build a new narrative. Maybe she wanted footage to send to media, or worse, to make it look like I was running some weird turtle zoo. I picked up the phone and called Dr. Vicky, who offered a clever suggestion. "Let's flip the narrative," she said. "Let's make the turtles famous for the right reasons." So we organized a local wildlife awareness day and invited some nearby schools. We partnered with the Conservation Board and set up a turtle education booth at the pond's edge. Parents brought their kids. We gave out stickers that said "Snap Happy" and taught them how turtles help maintain pond ecosystems. A local news station even showed up and did a 5-minute segment on community-led wildlife restoration. Chompers made his TV debut, basking on a log like he knew he was the star. Karen was nowhere in sight. But I knew she saw it. The story aired that night. The headline read "Neighborhood Pond Goes Green Thanks to Local Hero and Turtle Friends." The lawsuit hadn't gone to court yet. But in the court of public opinion, the verdict was shifting. Karen wasn't just fighting me anymore. She was fighting the truth. And every time she tried to escalate, I found another way to turn her attacks into fuel. I wasn't just defending my property. I was proving that no matter how loud someone screams, they can't drown out reality forever. And Karen, well, she was about to learn the hard way that sometimes the pond fights back without ever making a sound. I wasn't sure what Karen's next move would be, but I underestimated how far she'd go when backed into a corner. The lawsuit hadn't been dropped, and although my lawyer assured me we had every legal advantage, I could tell Karen wasn't aiming for justice. She was trying to bury me in paperwork, stress, and public perception. I should have expected it when I saw a city truck parked in front of my house one afternoon. 2 men with clipboards and high-vis vests walked up and introduced themselves as city zoning inspectors. "We're here about a structural complaint," one of them said. "Something about a dock extension over shared HOA land." I blinked. My dock? The same small wooden platform that had been part of the original property when I bought it 5 years ago? I led them to the backyard, where they examined the dock like it was a potential crime scene. One of them finally shrugged. "It's well within your property line, sir. Looks permitted. But you'd be surprised how often people report nonsense just to stir trouble." I wasn't surprised at all. I had a strong feeling who had stirred the pot this time. I thanked them and watched as they drove away, leaving me standing at the water's edge, staring at my peaceful pond with its slow-gliding turtles beneath the surface. Chompers popped his head up and blinked, and I couldn't help but mutter, "She's really going all in now, huh?" I decided to dig deeper, more than I ever had. If Karen was going to keep throwing dirt, I might as well see what she had buried. I started with public property records. Our county made most of them available online, but I went in person to the county clerk's office to review archived permits and property modifications. It took a while, but eventually I found something interesting: Karen's patio. According to her official plot layout, her backyard ended 5 feet short of where her concrete patio had been poured. That entire structure, complete with her hot tub and fire pit, was built over my property line. It had been done without permit, and more importantly, it was never disclosed during her home purchase. That meant she was technically encroaching on my land. I printed the documents and called Tamir. He reviewed everything and chuckled. "We've been playing defense this whole time," he said. "I think it's time we push back. Hard." We drafted a formal letter outlining the encroachment and notifying Karen that she had 30 days to remove the illegal structure or face legal action. I hand-delivered the letter, slipping it into her mailbox and taking a photo for proof. I didn't expect her to respond calmly. I expected fireworks, and I got them the very next morning. Karen barged onto my lawn in a bathrobe and slippers, screaming about trespassing, harassment, and something about fabricated zoning. She waved my letter in the air like a flag of war. I didn't say a word. I simply pointed at the property marker stakes I had carefully placed the night before, one of which stood smack in the middle of her patio. She went pale. "That can't be right," she muttered. "My contractor told me it was within bounds." I shrugged. "Maybe he misread the tape. You should have double-checked before pouring $20,000 of concrete onto someone else's property." She stomped back to her house, but I knew the damage was done. Karen thrived on intimidation and showmanship, but now she had something she couldn't explain away to her board or her lawyer. A trespass case against her would mean a serious blow to her credibility, not to mention fines. I didn't want her money. I didn't want her patio. I wanted her off my back, and out of my pond. But the more I pushed, the more desperate she became. 2 nights later, I got an anonymous tip. It came from Phil, the treasurer of the HOA, who called me quietly and said, "You didn't hear this from me, but I think you'll want to check Eventbrite." I pulled up the site and typed in Karen's name. My jaw clenched. There it was. A listing for a weekly event titled Karen's Private Paddle Parties, held at an undisclosed local pond with light refreshments, live music, and floating bar service. Tickets were $25 apiece. There were over 70 reviews, and nearly all of them praised the event. Many even included photos of the pond, my pond. I screen-captured everything. She hadn't just invaded my space. She had been profiting off it. I gathered the evidence, filed a report with both the city and the IRS, and handed the full packet to Tamir. "This just went from petty to criminal," he said, clearly impressed. "She's been running a business without a license, on land that doesn't belong to her, and she lied about it in a civil complaint. We're not just going to win now, we're going to dismantle her piece by piece." The next HOA meeting was a turning point. Karen tried to carry on as if nothing had happened. She welcomed residents, passed out agendas, and introduced a new topic about updating the neighborhood signage. But just as she began her speech, I raised my hand. "Karen," I said loudly enough for the room to fall quiet, "before we get to signage, I'd like to share something about unauthorized use of private land for commercial gain." She froze. I connected my laptop to the projector, something I'd coordinated with Phil ahead of time, and began playing a slideshow of screenshots from her Eventbrite listings, tax ID searches showing no business registration, and customer reviews with timestamp. The room went still. I looked around. Everyone had their eyes glued to the screen. When I finished, I turned to Karen. "Can you explain how these events were authorized under HOA guidelines?" She stammered something about community fundraising, but someone in the crowd asked, "Then where did the money go?" Another resident added, "I paid $50 for 2 tickets. That wasn't for fundraising. It was advertised as a VIP party." Karen's veneer cracked. She started babbling, accusing me of manipulation, saying I was stalking her, twisting facts. But it was too late. The board moved quickly. A vote of no confidence was called right then and there. It wasn't even close. Karen was stripped of her position as HOA president. An audit of all her activities was ordered. And a letter from my lawyer was read aloud, formally demanding removal of the patio within 30 days or court proceedings would begin. Karen stormed out of the room before the meeting ended, but I knew the final chapter hadn't been written yet. I went home that night and stood at the pond again, watching the moon reflect off the surface. Chompers slid silently beneath the water, unbothered by the drama, content in his little ecosystem. I felt the first breath of peace in weeks. But something told me Karen wasn't done. People like her never admitted defeat. They just changed tactics. But this time, I was ahead of her. She had started a war with someone who didn't back down, and I had the law, the footage, and a snapping turtle with the perfect timing on my side. As I went inside, I checked my phone. A new email popped up. It was from a local journalist. I heard about what happened at the HOA meeting. Would you be willing to speak about private property rights and how you handled it without violence or escalation? I stared at the screen. Maybe this wasn't just about reclaiming a pond anymore. Maybe it was about showing how to stand up to entitled bullies with nothing but truth, patience, and the occasional reptile. I smiled, clicked reply, and typed one line. I'd be happy to share the story. The turtles would be proud. The morning sun had barely crept over the trees when I heard the sound of construction equipment reversing in short, shrill beat. I walked out onto my porch with a mug of coffee and watched a demolition crew roll into Karen's backyard. Two men with clipboards stood beside a marked-off section where her grand patio used to stretch arrogantly past her property line and onto mine. I had filed the legal notice 3 weeks earlier. Karen had tried to delay, dispute, and deny, but the boundary line didn't lie, and neither did the city zoning office after they got a formal complaint supported by aerial photos, property maps, and a judge's signature. Her fire pit, hot tub, pergola, and elaborate stonework were all being reduced to rubble that morning. I sipped my coffee slowly, watching the excavator's claw rip up slabs of concrete like crackers. Karen stood by the fence in silence, arms crossed, eyes swollen with rage but no longer fire. Her days of storming into meetings with clipboards and false confidence were over. I thought she might scream, throw something, or call the police, but all she did was watch as the last remnants of her illegal backyard oasis were hauled away in a dump truck. Her HOA presidency was gone, her fraudulent party business was exposed, and her reputation had been thoroughly demolished, right along with her patio. You'd think that would be enough to bring the saga to a satisfying close. And for a while it felt like it. The neighborhood began to shift. The new HOA president, an older gentleman named Rob with actual listening skills and a background in municipal planning, invited me to help revise the bylaws. We worked together to clarify property boundaries and ensure that no future disputes like mine could even be considered. People who used to whisper about the pond now came by to admire it. School groups made regular trips to learn about wetland conservation. Even the local news followed up with a segment titled From HOA Drama to Eco-Nirvana featuring Chompers front and center, lazily munching on a snail. But if there was one thing I'd learned, it was that Karen didn't know how to lose quietly. Weeks after the demolition, I received notice that she was appealing her property encroachment ruling, claiming she had been misled by her contractor and that the HOA had given her verbal permission years ago. The claim was weak, and the court dismissed it almost immediately, but the delay was her real goal. She was stalling, trying to make herself relevant again. That's when I got the idea to close this chapter in a way she couldn't ignore, but wouldn't dare challenge. I reached out to Dr. Vicky again, who was thrilled to hear from me. She'd been keeping tabs on the turtles, checking the ecosystem periodically, and she had a proposition. Why not make the pond an officially recognized conservation zone? With a few signatures, a certification from the county, and a small donation to the local wildlife foundation, my pond could become protected land. That meant no more unauthorized boat parties, no construction within 25 feet of the shoreline, and a permanent educational marker installed on-site. It would be registered, mapped, and shielded from HOA interference forever. We filed the paperwork. The foundation even offered to host a dedication ceremony. That morning, the pond looked more alive than ever. Kids gathered on the dock, wildlife volunteers gave out brochures, and someone set up a turtle-shaped cake that was so realistic it made me flinch. Chompers surfaced on cue during the ceremony, poking his head up just as the mayor's assistant unveiled the new marker. It read Lake Marston Ecological Reserve, named after my family's surname. Karen watched the whole thing from behind her window blinds. She didn't attend. She didn't say a word. But I knew she saw it. And I knew she realized she'd lost something more than just a patio. She'd lost the illusion of control. After the event, I sat by the water, feet dangling off the dock. A father and his son were throwing bits of lettuce toward the turtles. A teenager was sketching one of the willows. The pond was no longer just mine. It was something shared, but not in the way Karen had intended. It was respected now. Protected. Appreciated for what it was rather than exploited for ego or spectacle. Later that week, Karen put her house on the market. The listing avoided any mention of the recently demolished patio or the ongoing HOA scandal. Instead, it used phrases like peaceful community, wildlife views, and easy access to local landmark. I couldn't help but laugh. She'd tried to claim the pond for herself, then for the neighborhood, then for profit. And now she was selling her proximity to it like a feature she'd earned. A few neighbors speculated about where she'd go next. Some thought she'd move to a condo with strict management, where she could let someone else take the reins while still complaining to anyone who'd listen. Others joked she'd become an Airbnb host, renting out basements and creating laminated rule sheets longer than the Constitution. I didn't care where she went. She was no longer my problem. Tamir and I celebrated the final dropped claim over dinner, toasting with cheap wine and quoting some of Karen's worst HOA meeting lines like inside joke. He said I should write a book about it. I told him maybe I would, something about snapping turtles and territorial boundaries. He laughed and said it'd be a bestseller in every suburb across America. That night, I returned home and walked once again to the pond. The moonlight shimmered over the water. Chompers was floating silently near the reeds. I took a deep breath, feeling something I hadn't felt since before Karen arrived. Not just peace, but pride. I had stood my ground. Not by yelling, threatening, or breaking rules, but by leaning into truth, documentation, and a little wild creativity. I hadn't needed revenge. I just needed resilience. The war that began with a boat party had ended with a wildlife reserve. What started as an invasion had evolved into preservation. And the villain of the story had written her own ending, forced out not by force, but by her own hubris. The turtles were still here. The pond still glistened. And for the first time in months, there was no more splashing, no yelling, no music echoing through the trees. Just the quiet rhythm of water and the soft rustle of wind through the willows. The kind of silence that comes only after the last chapter is finally written.